Day. Today is Thursday, 3rd October, and I'm making this program in the aftermath of the Iranian missile strike on Israel and the Israeli incursion, the news of the Israeli incursion into Lebanon. And there is heavy fog of war over both. We're getting very little, very scattered information about what is actually happening, both in terms of the effectiveness of the Iranian missile strike and in terms of the success or otherwise of the Israeli operation in South Lebanon. And there's no doubt, and in fact it's been admitted, it's been acknowledged, there's been a report about this, for example, on Zero Hedge, but apparently it's been widely acknowledged elsewhere, that the main reason why we're getting this very heavy fog of war is because the Israeli authorities have tightened information control, and they're being very careful to ensure that only a limited amount of information, both about the progress of the operation in southern Lebanon and about the Iranian missile strike, reaches the wider public. The only concrete information that we have is confirmation that the Mossad building close to Tel Aviv was severely damaged. I haven't seen pictures of the entire building, but I've seen pictures of several parts of the building, and it does look as if it was very badly hit. And, well, there's been two pictures showing some damage to buildings in the giant Nevatim base, one of Israel's biggest air bases, located in the Negev desert. This is a colossal base. It has 4 airfields and apparently extends over a territory that spans 50 square kilometers. So we're talking about a huge area. Anyway, there's been 2 photos taken from satellites. I'm not sure which satellites, which show some damage to buildings on the Nevatim base, which show that some missiles, at least, did get through. It's not clear whether the damage to these buildings was done by the missiles themselves or by debris from missiles that had been intercepted. Who knows? But anyway, something at least, some damage to the Nevatim base does appear to have been done. Now, the photos, these 2 photos, are very limited in the information they provide. They don't show the runways. One photo does show a row of aircraft, but they're not fighter jets. They're turboprop. They seem to be either turboprop cargo aircraft or small passenger jets, which might be used for electronic warfare or VIP movement or something of that kind. But they don't show fighter jets. So the photos don't either confirm or disprove the claims that the Iranians have been making, that up to 20 F-35, some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, stealth fighter jets supplied to Israel by the United States. Anyway, these photos neither prove nor disprove Iranian claims that up to 20 of these fighter jets were destroyed. Now, an American military magazine, Military Watch magazine, which does seem to have some connections to the US military, there are large numbers of American military-connected magazines in the United States. There's a huge media in the United States that is clustered around the US military. Anyway, they've published two articles, one which, both of which do seem to support claims that significant damage was done by the Iranian missile strike. The first one reads, "Massive Iranian missile strike completely destroys," and that's a quote, Israeli F-35 base Nevatim. Well, that's clearly wrong. I mean, the two photos don't support that claim. "Stealth fighters destroyed," reports. That's what it says, and it talks about how footage from Israel has confirmed the impact of dozens of ballistic missiles, which Israel's air defense network failed to shoot down, with targets impacted, including the headquarters of the intelligence agency Mossad. And then it goes on to discuss the attack on Nevatim, and that reports doesn't make clear which reports. Do they mean Iranian reports? Have indicated that the bulk of Nevatim's airbase's F-35s, over 20 fighters, were destroyed in the attack, with the stealth fighters representing one of the most high-value targets in Israel. And we are then told that Israel fields just 2 squadrons of the costly stealth fighters and relies on them heavily, as the remainder of the fighter fleet relies on largely obsolete avionics and old mechanically scanned array radars. But as I said, it is not at all clear where the information upon which this article is based in Military Watch magazine comes from. And, well, there is another article, and this article, also in Military Watch magazine, asks the question, did Iran just end Israel's invasion of Lebanon? One missile barrage may be all it takes. And they said that according to multiple sources, the Iranian missile barrage caused serious damage to the country's military infrastructure. The damage done by the operation has raised questions regarding whether Israel can still continue its ongoing invasion of neighboring Lebanon, which began less than 2 days before the Iranian strikes were launched. Multiple sources. Again, what are these sources? As I said, I don't know what these sources are. Are they the Iranians? Are they sources in Israel, or are they sources within the US military? Multiple sources have reported that the strikes targeted key air bases, such as Hazerim Air Base, where Israeli F-15s are based, as well as Nevatim Air Base, which hosts all of Israel's F-35 stealth fighters. And then we're told that Iranian sources have reported that the latter facility was completely destroyed, with multiple F-35s lost. As I said, it clearly hasn't been completely destroyed. Then Military Watch magazine goes on to say, reports have since emerged that missile strikes also targeted troop concentrations, including a particularly large concentration of tanks and armored vehicles, which could further seriously complicate future Israeli offensives. All of this is very interesting, but as I said, it's difficult to assess how reliable any of it is. Military Watch magazine does appear to me to get some information from people within the US military, but I'm not going to pretend that I know a huge amount about its sources or how reliable it is. It's just that this is an American military or military connected publication, and they do appear to be suggesting that the Iranian military strike was indeed effective. Now, if it was, that begs many questions, because in order for the Iranians to conduct a successful strike, that hit F-35s on the ground and perhaps F-15s at the other base, airbase, ETHEREUM, and also to strike at a large concentration of tanks and armoured vehicles. The Israelis would need very, very effective data and intelligence. Now, it could be that they're obtaining this information, this intelligence themselves, maybe from Hezbollah, maybe from agents inside Israel, maybe from whatever electronic mechanisms of surveillance Israel possesses, just saying. But if the damage done was as extensive as is being suggested in these articles in Military Watch magazine, and as the Israelis are claiming, then I can't help but think that the Iranians, who have obviously intelligence capabilities of their own, but not, I would have thought, sufficient to keep constant track of what is happening inside Israel itself. The Iranians would have needed help from a much more powerful and sophisticated third party with data gathering and targeting capabilities that would be needed for these kind of long-range missile strikes. And though we will never get any admissions about this, certainly not from the Iranians, and certainly not from the only possible third party that could be, if that is indeed what has happened, then the third party in question must be the Russians. It must be the case that the Russians are using their massive intelligence and surveillance systems, their satellites and their other systems, which may not be on the scale of those of the United States, but which are extensive and sophisticated, as we have seen in the war in Ukraine. The Russians must be providing data to the Iranians, and they must also, in that case, be providing information to the Iranians about what the strikes have achieved. And if it is indeed the Russians who are providing this information, then perhaps that might lend weight or credence to the Iranian claim that 20 F-35s were damaged or destroyed at the Nevatim airbase. Anyway, I'm not going to pretend that I know. Missiles did get through. Damage was done. It may be that that damage was very significant. I doubt that we will ever get confirmation, public confirmation, anytime soon. We will eventually, I expect, but perhaps not any time soon. But it does matter. It does matter because how effective this Iranian strike was will no doubt shape future decisions. And if the Russians were involved, I've no doubt that the Israelis and the Americans will have worked that fact out. As I said, if this strike went beyond known Iranian capabilities, and I have to assume that the United States and Israel are very familiar with Iranian capabilities in the data collection and guidance field, then of course the Americans and the Israelis will know that the shadow of Russia has fallen on this conflict, and that will undoubtedly affect their decisions going forward. So, this is all very speculative, but as I said, there's heavy fog of war, and I can't be sure. Now, one thing I am going to say, which is that putting aside what Military Watch magazine is telling us, what that article in the Daily Telegraph was telling us yesterday about how some of the missiles did get through, there is none of that sense of buoyancy and euphoria that followed the attack that the Iranians conducted against Israel in April this year. At that time, by everyone's admission, the vast bulk of the drones and the cruise missiles that Iran launched against Israel were shot down. Many of them were shot down by fighter jets, American fighter jets, as well as Israeli fighter jets. This time, because ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles were used in the strike. Instead, well, I've read reports in The Guardian specifically that US aircraft and British aircraft and Israeli fighter aircraft were completely ineffective. Their missiles and the aircraft themselves do not have the speed to be able to keep up with the high supersonic ballistic missiles and the hypersonic missiles that Iran launched as part of this barrage. Now, the US, Jake Sullivan, for example, Tony Blinken, those sort of people are saying that the strike was ineffective, but I've noticed that they're not giving us numbers for the number of missiles, Iranian missiles, that they say were shot down. Neither, so far as I know, are the Israelis. We're told that around 200 missiles were launched. We're not told how many of those were shot down. As I said, there's none of that atmosphere of buoyancy. I can't help but think that this is perhaps the strongest indicator of all that this missile attack did have a significant effect. So that's the story with the missile attack to the extent that I can judge it. Now, what about the fighting that's been going on in southern Lebanon? Now, I'm going to make a quick observation here. I saw the film and pictures of the Israeli tanks and armored vehicles trundling towards the Lebanon border. There were quite a lot of photos. And I have to say that one thing immediately struck me, which is that none of the sort of precautions against drone attacks and other things that one now sees on Russian and Ukrainian armored vehicles in the conflict in Ukraine appear to have been applied to the Israeli vehicles that I saw in these pictures. It was like going back in time to a time before the Ukrainian war. Now, it could be that Israel has assessed that Hezbollah doesn't have the kind of drone and anti-tank missile capabilities that one sees used every day in the conflict in Ukraine. But I do wonder also whether just possibly it may be the case that Israel, maybe Hezbollah as well, have been left behind to some extent by current military developments. There's another article, which I'm going to get to shortly, which complains that military technology in the conflict in Ukraine is developing incredibly rapidly, and what it describes as the sclerotic US military industries are not able to catch up and have no real understanding of the speed of these developments. And perhaps that reflects the situation with Israel also. But anyway, put that aside, we're not getting very much information about what is actually going on in southern Lebanon. What I have seen in the Israeli media this morning are further reports of missile and rocket barrages carried out by Hezbollah on targets in northern Israel. So it is clear that Hezbollah remains intact. It continues to be a significant force. It is able to launch missiles and rockets at into northern Israel. It seems that despite the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and of other top Hezbollah officials, Hezbollah's command and control systems are still functioning, at least up to a certain level. And the very scattered reports we are getting about what is going on in southern Lebanon also seem to confirm that. Now, yesterday, the Israelis admitted to the death of 8 soldiers, which suggests intense fighting. That is, a large number of soldiers for Israel to lose in a firefight over a course of a relatively short period of time. There are reports of Israeli units being ambushed by Hezbollah fighters. There's lots of reports of that kind of thing. Again, whether these are scattered examples of resistance by, particularly tough and determined fighters, or whether, on the contrary, the Israelis are advancing into territory which is strongly defended by Hezbollah because of the fact that Hezbollah continues to fight as an effective force. Again, that I simply don't know. What I will say is that reports from Lebanon, from the Lebanese authorities, seem to be speaking about Israeli attacks having been repelled. The Lebanese authorities, well, Hezbollah has a certain influence over them, but they're not identical to Hezbollah. Perhaps they have more reliable information, and if that information which they are giving is true, then it does look as if Hezbollah does still continue to function and is still resisting the Israelis in southern Lebanon. So again, there is fog of war. The Israeli authorities are telling us very little. Perhaps at this early stage in the fighting, one should not expect otherwise. But again, I have to say that if things were going really well on the ground in southern Lebanon, on the basis of what we've seen recently, I would expect the Israelis to be telling us this. I would expect confident and even triumphant reports from Israeli officials, and for the moment at least, we are not getting them, which suggests that there is indeed a great deal of resistance. Now, speaking of the Lebanese authorities, the Lebanese have now confirmed, the Lebanese foreign minister, in an interview with CNN, has confirmed information also provided by the Iranian foreign minister, which is that shortly before his death, Hassan Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah, had agreed to a ceasefire. He'd actually agreed to a ceasefire, presumably the 21-day ceasefire, that the Americans and the French was seeking to broker between Israel and Hezbollah. And he apparently communicated the fact that he'd agreed that ceasefire was communicated to the French and to the Americans. And then, of course, almost immediately after, very short time after, the Israelis launched their airstrike, the airstrike in which he was killed. Now, maybe there is no cause and effect here. Maybe one shouldn't look for cause and effect. But of course, inevitably, some people are going to say, and to say it frankly, my own inclination strongly is that the Israeli leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials emphatically did not want and do not want a ceasefire on the South Lebanon border. And for that reason, and that was the reason why, one of the reasons why they took the decision at that moment to go after and kill Nasrallah. And maybe if Nasrallah assumed that a ceasefire was about to happen, that might to some extent explain why he was in that particular building with much of his team, and why apparently a major general of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was also present at that meeting, and fewer precautions were taken. Well, that then brings us back to the complicated question of the role of the Americans and what they're going to do. And we have had an astonishing article from Politico about this whole situation. The article says that President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu have now become deeply antagonistic at a personal level to each other. Apparently there are occasions when voices are raised when they speak to each other over the phone, that they often disagree, that President Biden is becoming frustrated by the way in which Prime Minister Netanyahu continuously goes behind agreements, informal or otherwise, that President Biden appears to think that they have reached, and the way in which Prime Minister Netanyahu simply makes decisions which go against President Biden's wishes and policies. There's even references in this article to President Biden feeling that Prime Minister Netanyahu is, in effect, turning him into a lame duck. And, well, we're also getting reports that even as the Israelis are talking about taking action against Iran, the Americans are once more advising against this. They have apparently ruled out completely any idea that the United States would itself participate in a direct attack on Iran. They have told the Israelis that they do not want to see attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities. They are also saying, apparently, that they're not hugely keen on attacks on Iranian oil production and supply facilities, either on the basis of previous events. It could very well be that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, who have spoken about a decisive, crushing response to the Iranian missile strike, it could be that the Israelis will simply ignore all this advice and warnings that they're getting from the United States. And why shouldn't they? Because we've had the earlier reports, also from Politico, that even as the Biden administration was supposedly trying to broker a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, even as Hassan Nasrallah was agreeing to that very ceasefire that the Americans were trying to broker, White House aides were meeting with Israeli officials and telling them to go right on ahead and strike at Hezbollah, and do so in the confident knowledge that once that had happened, the United States would back Israel to the hilt. So the Americans say one thing to Hezbollah and to the outside world, and in private, at least some Americans, and well-connected Americans, are telling completely different things to the Israelis. And that, of course, brings us back to the question of what the president himself is doing. Because on the one hand, we hear all about how frustrated he is with Prime Minister Netanyahu and how angry he is, and about the raised voices that take place over the course of their conversations. But on the other hand, we learn that White House aides, the president's own aides, are meeting with Israeli officials and are encouraging Israeli officials to take steps that are contradictory to the president's stated policies. And notice that these aides remain in place. There's no sign that the president intends to dismiss them or to take any action to discipline them. I would have thought that if they were really acting against his wishes, he would dismiss them. Just saying. They are, after all, his aides. But apparently the president is not prepared to do that. And, well, that has to give the impression that either the president is playing a complicated game in which he's himself encouraging the Israelis to seek escalation whilst pretending to the rest of the world and to other members of the US government and perhaps to people in the United States that he is not, or in the alternative, that the president has been reduced to a cipher, that he's simply the occupant of the Oval Office, and that nobody any longer is paying the slightest attention to his opinions and his decisions. One way or the other, it is an astonishing state of affairs. And again, one wonders whether all of these warnings that the Americans are giving to the Israelis not to go for nuclear weapon sites or potential nuclear weapon sites in Iran. Of course, Iran says that it doesn't have nuclear weapons, and American intelligence agrees with them. Anyway, not to go for nuclear sites in Iran, not to go for energy sites in Iran, to consider instead attacks on Iranian proxies in Iraq, Syria, and in other places. Well, whether any of that ought to be taken seriously. I do believe that the United States means what it says when it tells Israel at this time that the United States will not be directly party to any attack on Iran. I think the Pentagon, which has got its hands full with Ukraine and is worried about the situation in the Pacific and the South China Sea, absolutely does not want to take on the massive commitment that might arise in the event that there were an all-out war with Iran. And I think that the Pentagon is telling the president this and is making its views very clear. There were those reports a couple of days ago, last week, that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was furious with the Israelis for their attack on Nasrallah and was angry that the United States had not been consulted in advance and simply doesn't want this additional commitment to be landed on him at this particular time, a commitment of involving a wider war. So I believe that pretty much the entire US government, even those White House aides that want the attack on Hezbollah, are at the moment telling the Israelis that the United States will not be involved directly in an attack on Iran. I think quite apart from the Pentagon's concerns, I think the administration understands that the involvement of the US, a decision by the US to involve itself in another war in the Middle East, would not play well with the American people at a time when a presidential election is only a few weeks away. But of course, the Israelis may say to themselves, well, the president tells us all of this, the administration tells us all of this, the US government tells us all of this, but we don't really need to pay too much attention because they say that we shouldn't attack the nuclear sites, they say we shouldn't attack the other locations inside Iran. But if we do, they will be there to support us anyway. And if we do want that wider war with Iran, which many Israeli officials, including in articles in the Israeli media, have said that they do, if we do get ourselves involved in that bigger war with Iran, well, the Americans, in effect, whatever they may say, will be there. The article in Politico said that the president's visceral feelings are to support Israel, whatever it is that the Israelis ultimately do, however angry and frustrated he may be with them. And I think the political and strategic realities are such that if Israel does get itself involved in some big war with Iran, absent strong action from the United States to prevent that happening, there is a very real probability or possibility that the United States will find itself drawn in. So, if the Israeli leadership really is thinking about a wider attack on Iran, well, all of these warnings from the United States might go unheeded, if only because most of them, the Israelis, on past experience, have come to realize don't need to be taken seriously. So, it now depends on what the Israelis are going to do. And that brings us back once more to the effect of the Iranian missile strike. Because if the Iranian missile strike was effective, if Russia was involved, if the Russians are establishing a presence in Iran, and as far as I'm aware, Prime Minister Mishustin of Russia is still there in Tehran, well, if that is true, then that might actually be more of a deterrent than what the Americans are saying. I get the sense that Israel does not want to tangle with the Russians. Now, I may be wrong about that too. It may be that the Russian presence in Iran is not that great. There are dribbles of reports that Russian air defense systems have been supplied to Iran, but I don't know what the state of those air defense systems is, whether there are Russian technicians involved in them, whether the Russians are assisting Iran to defend its key sites. Who knows? And I don't know also how much information the Russians might be providing to Iran. It's only my guess that they probably provided, or they may have provided, guidance and intelligence information to enable the Iranians to conduct their missile strike and to assess its effectiveness. But it could be, and these are the unanswered questions, that the Russians are providing a great deal of information and that they might be able, for example, to give the Iranians prior notice in the event that the Israelis start making preparations for a big strike against Iran. And there has been one telltale event over the last few hours which might point at Israel, for its part, trying to give the Russians some kind of a warning. Because there are reports this morning that the Israelis conducted a missile strike on some kind of ammunition or equipment depot or warehouse in northern Syria, located a reasonably short distance from Russia's Khmeimim airbase in Syria. And, well, it could be that the Israelis were conducting this strike because it's just another Iranian or Iranian proxy facility in Syria, and they've acted many times to attack those. Or it could be, given the proximity of this facility to Russia's Khmeimim airbase, that the Israelis were sending their own warning to the Russians. Again, who knows? My own feeling is that there is a very, very complicated and intricate chess game, or poker game perhaps, more accurately, taking place, involving the Israelis, the Iranians, the Russians and the Americans, all of them engaging in a fair amount of bluff and counter bluff, maneuvering around each other, and one hopes also at some level also talking to each other. There are significant problems with this poker game. The Americans, their main poker player, isn't playing. Apparently he's there in the Oval Office getting angry, but he's not able to do very much because either people ignore what he says or because he doesn't know himself what he wants. Just saying. But the Russians certainly are playing their cards, and so are the Israelis, and so are the Iranians. Now, when we speak about the Iranians, they're the supreme leader of Iran, Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, is apparently due to lead Friday prayers in Tehran on Friday. There are suggestions that this is an extremely unusual thing for the supreme leader to do, that it is that it is something he tends to do only when there is a crisis which needs to be addressed. And there are also some rumors that over the course of these ceremonies in Tehran, he intends tomorrow to announce a change in Iran's nuclear policies. And that would be a most concerning development, most ominous development. But there have been reports in the British media, several articles in the British media, in the Financial Times and in the Guardian, and I believe also in the Daily Telegraph, which have spoken about how, in the face of these recent events, there is a real possibility that Iran might finally put aside its inhibitions and press forward straightforwardly towards acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, which I would have thought, if it happens, would escalate the situation even further and might provoke an action by Israel and potentially even the United States, which is where perhaps further warnings from the Russians to the Israelis and to the United States might become important. But I'm not going to try and anticipate what Khamenei is going to say. Maybe the Russians are advising him to draw back from that. Who knows? We're just going to have to wait and see. But to return again to what my point, I think that we are involved in a very, very complex and intricate poker game in which, frankly, the question of whether there is going to be war or peace in the Middle East, when I mean peace, I mean only a very cold peace. There will still be fighting, There will be fighting in Gaza. There will be fighting in southern Lebanon. There are, of course, missile strikes by Hezbollah on northern Israel. All of that will continue. There's tension in the West Bank between the settlers and the Palestinians. All of that will, of course, continue. But whether there will be an all-out war between Iran and Israel, that will depend very much on how the poker game plays out. And to be frank, I suspect that the Russians now, behind the scenes, are quite plausibly playing a significant role. But again, let me repeat once more, that's theorizing, that's speculation, but there are the clues there, and I would say that they do point very much in that direction. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has in the past, and indeed recently, shown that he is a very skilled poker player. Indeed, he has in the past, contrary to his reputation in some places, known when to stop. I wonder whether he knows when to stop this time. So everything is balanced on a knife edge. It's difficult to know exactly what's going on. There is a very tense situation along the border. There is fighting going on between the Israeli army and Hezbollah. For the moment, it does look as if Hezbollah has survived the attacks of the last few weeks and that it is intact and able to hit back. And we see Iran making strong moves, and it's for the Israelis now ultimately to decide what they're going to do, and perhaps also think about the Russians. So, a very high stakes poker game, and I don't know exactly who the players are on each side, though Putin clearly will be involved, and Netanyahu as well, and obviously the Iranians too. I strongly suspect that Khamenei himself now is making the key decisions in Tehran, and that President Pezeshkian has been sidelined. We'll just have to wait and see. These are three very intelligent people, whatever else you may think about them. They have diametrically opposed views. I think there is a certain degree of mutual respect between them as well. I think this is even true of Netanyahu and Khamenei, though obviously they've never had any direct contacts. But I think each of them assesses the other probably quite accurately as, a tough and formidable adversary. And certainly Netanyahu and Putin know each other very well. And Netanyahu, by all accounts, is urgently seeking a call with Putin. And I would not be surprised if that takes place at some point over the next few hours. And if it does, that may be the sign we need about whether or not there is going to be war or peace. Anyway, there we are. Since I've been talking a bit about the Russians, I will quickly say that another Russian, another formidable player, is in New York at the moment, and that is the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He has delivered to the UN General Assembly what I judge to be one of the most powerful speeches to the UN General Assembly that I have heard for a very long time. One in which he gave what I thought was a masterly lecture on the crisis in international relations and the failure of the United Nations, and ultimately the responsibility for the crisis in international relations, which he placed firmly on the United States. It's worth tracking down and either reading or listening to the speech, but I'm not going to discuss it in this program because doing so is just going to add even further to the time. One thing I will say, since I'm talking now about the United Nations, is that at the United Nations there was also a meeting between the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, who is also President Xi Jinping's National Security Advisor, and US Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And the Chinese readout of this meeting is excoriating. Over the last 2 years, I've been reading one readout after another coming from the Chinese of their interactions with top American officials, and each one becomes harsher than the one that preceded it. This is the harshest of all. And over the course of it, Wang Yi straightforwardly told Blinken that the Chinese consider the United States to be two-faced, that on the one hand it talks peace and friendship to China, and on the other hand, it does everything it can within its power to contain and to push back China, and that this is an impossible thing for the United States to go on doing, and that this is wrecking the entire relationship between China and the United States. Now, all of this is apparently preparing the ground for a telephone call or a virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden. And, well, we will see what the Chinese have to tell us about that call. But it doesn't look as if relations between China and the United States are going at all well at the present time. Anyway, there we are. We will see where we're going. I'm going to just add one very last thing about this affair, which is that yesterday, over the course of my summary of events, I said that there were reports that the Iranians had informed the Russians and the Americans just before they launched their missile strike. Of course, if the Russians were involved in providing targeting and satellite data, then by definition, they would have been informed because they would have been engaged in planning the Iranian missile strike. And that would explain why the Americans were tipped off, because the Russians almost certainly would have insisted that the Americans be informed in advance of the fact that there would be a missile strike in order to ensure that any American personnel were put in places of safety and were not at risk as a result of the attack that took place, the strike that took place. And if the Russians were involved, that would explain further things, which is that the Russians would almost certainly have insisted that there be no civilian casualties. And as far as we know, there were either none, apart from one Palestinian man who was unlucky enough to be caught as the debris fell. That would explain why there were no civilian casualties. The Russians would not have wanted to see large numbers of civilian casualties in Israel, if only because the Russians almost certainly are working to try to prevent an uncontrolled escalation. And it would also explain other things about the strike, why only specifically military targets were selected. The kind of targets that were chosen were the kind of targets that one would expect the Russians to pick. Netanyahu himself obviously was alerted in advance. There's even pictures apparently of him running to his bunker to try to take to hide from the missiles as they came in. The Russians almost certainly, if they were involved, would have pushed hard against any idea of a decapitation strike. As I've said it before many times, the Russians remain fundamentally averse to that sort of thing. And besides, they probably would feel that they need Netanyahu alive in order to negotiate a ceasefire with him. Anyway, let's wait and see what happens over the next couple of days. What else can we do? Let's see whether the Israelis do launch their attack and how extensive it is. Let's see what the Americans do. Let's see whether Netanyahu and Putin do speak with each other and what comes out of that conversation. And let's also see what Khamenei says, assuming he does go to Friday prayers. And let's wait and see if he does make some of the announcements that some people fear that he may make. Anyway, that is my summary of the situation in the Middle East today. We're on the knife edge between war and peace, between Israel and Iran. The President of the United States is apparently ineffective. There is a risk that the United States could be drawn into another war, this time against Iran. And it all depends now on the calculations of Netanyahu and Khamenei, whether or not that happens, and to any role that the Russians might have, about which I'm not even sure. Not at all a happy situation to be in. Anyway, let's now turn to that other conflict, and we're getting more and more statements now from Kiev. I'm talking about the conflict in Ukraine. More and more statements now from Kiev that the Ukrainians are not going to compromise in any way whatsoever. President Zelensky continues to insist on war until victory, apparently. He wants to keep on fighting. This is a report in The Guardian effectively said as much. And his objective continues to be that which it has always been, to recover all Ukrainian territory right up to the 1991 borders, including Crimea itself. And all of this seems increasingly deluded as the news pours in from the battlefronts. Now, over the last couple of days, we've had the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Vuhledar. There has been no announcement from the Russian Defense Ministry that Vuhledar has fallen, but nobody doubts that it has. I saw a report that of the 72nd Brigade that was defending Vuhledar, the main brigade that was defending Vuhledar, well, apparently they got the order, maybe from Ivan Vinik, their now sacked commander, to escape north to Bogoyavlenka, the village to the north. But only 350 men apparently got through. That's what one claim has said. I don't know whether this is true, by the way, but I saw that figure somewhere. That only 350 men out of a total brigade number of around 2,000 managed to get through and escape. In other words, the brigade has been completely destroyed. There are reports that the Russians are 1 kilometer from Bogoyavlenka and are intending to storm this village over the next couple of days. There are also reports that the Russians are now heavily bombing the other village of Novoukrayinka, just to the northwest of Ugledar, and that village is also likely to fall, also within the next few days. Perhaps even more alarming for the Ukrainians, further north in the Kurakhovo area, there are reports that the Russians pushing south from Tsukurinye, and this may be evidenced by the way that Tsukurinye has fallen, though there is no confirmation of this. But there are reports that the Russians pushing south from Tsukurinye have now entered another village further south called Novoselidovo, and it's been pointed out that if the Russians capture this particular village, then the Ukrainian troops still fighting in Girnik, of which supposedly the Russians already control half, and in all the other villages, Kurakhovka, Izmailovka, all of these villages, that the Ukrainian troops there, several thousands of them, would in that case be surrounded and would find themselves in a genuine cauldron. Well, there are these reports. I'm not able, again, to verify them, but various mapping projects are now colouring more and more of the territory south of Selidovo red, and it does look as if the Russians are capturing more and more ground, and perhaps if the reports that they've advanced all the way to Novoselidovo are accurate, maybe Tsukurinye has now also fallen. If so, it wouldn't surprise me. But let me stress, that's just my own personal deduction. There are no reports so far to that effect. So, a terrible disaster developing for the Ukrainians on that front. Further north, pretty much all of the mapping projects have now admitted that Nikolaevka, the village immediately to the south of Mirnograd, is now under Russian control. Again, the Russian Defense Ministry has told us nothing about this. They've not confirmed that Grodivka is also under their control. They've not formally confirmed that Ostrovye, the village close to Kurakhovo, on the Kurakhovo reservoir that I was talking about yesterday, is under Russian control, though this was alluded to, oddly enough, in an eyewitness account which was reported by the Russian Defense Ministry. But anyway, it does seem that closer to Pokrovsk itself, the Russians are now capturing more and more fortified positions, such as they are south of Pokrovsk, with Selidovo now 2/3 surrounded and likely to fall within the next couple of days, maybe. It might very well be that we will see the attack on Pokrovsk, on Mirnograd begin before the autumn rains start at some point within the next couple of days. Just saying. Anyway, we will see. So, a very bad situation for the Ukrainians there. A catastrophic situation for the Ukrainians in the Toretsk area. The Russians have now said that they've captured another village north of Nelipovka, which is a place called Leonidivka. The point here is that this is starting to place Russian troops northwest of Toretsk. In other words, the remaining Ukrainian troops in this area, in fighting in Toretsk itself, are once again at real risk of having their supplies cut. And in central Toretsk, according to Radovka, the Russians are now within 200 meters of the coal mine that lies at the western side of Radovka, of Toretsk. If they are able to capture this coal mine and the slag heap, and Ukrainian resistance here seems to be very fragile, well, then that will put the Russians in a strong position to capture the rest of Toretsk. In fact, it's widely accepted that if that happens, Toretsk will fall probably within just a few days. So, major battle taking place in Toretsk, probably coming to a rapid end. And of course, yesterday we had that extraordinary report, which, by the way, has startled many people, about the Russian capture of the village of Verkhnokamianska, just to the east of Seversk, at the northern end of the line of contact in Donbass. And our old friend, Andrei Marochko, is now describing the situation to TASS, to the official Russian news agency TASS, in this way. After our troops have conducted successful operations and liberated the settlement of Verkhnokamianska, the Ukrainian combat group positioned in the area of Belogorovka and west of Lysychansk has been semi-encircled. Russian forces have created a kill zone for enemy troops. Actually, all the paths of the enemy's retreat are under our troops' gunfire. The shortest distance between our troops that are encircling Ukrainian armed formations is about 8 kilometers. This is what Marochko has said. So apparently a group of Ukrainian soldiers are, well, not exactly in a cauldron, but something close to it. They'll have to retreat. If they don't retreat, they will be in a cauldron. And if they do retreat, they will suffer significant losses because, according to Marochko, they will have to pass through what is in effect a kill zone. And I'm not going to try and guess how many Ukrainian troops we're talking about. I'm guessing a couple of hundred. Anyway, there we are. That is what Marochko says. And it is likely also that we're going to see an attack on Seversk fairly soon. And further north still, there's been lots of fighting in the Kupiansk area, in the area of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. The Russians have been conducting very complex and very big operations in the area east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers since early summer. I haven't made any attempt to keep track of these events. Suffice to say that a lot of territory, a lot of villages have passed under Russian control, and that the Russians do now seem to control significant stretches of the east bank of the Zherebets River, though they haven't yet, as far as I can see, reached the Oskol River. But anyway, there is a lot of fighting taking place there. And this has to be connected with the fighting close to Seversk and with Verkhnokamianska having fallen. More likely than not, an attack on Seversk itself is just over the horizon. So there's been no news or little news from Chasiv Yar, but we saw that we've just seen with the capture of Verkhnokamianska that the Russians can advance suddenly, or we can learn suddenly about Russian advances of which we were previously unaware. So it's quite likely that all kinds of things are happening in Chasiv Yar. And a group of forces north have told us that they've advanced a further 3.5 kilometers in the area of the Kursk pocket, but they're not telling us where that advance is, though they are talking about heavy fighting going on around Plechovo, suggesting that the pocket is likely to be cut fairly soon. So, with all of this, and with the Russian Defense Ministry claiming that the Ukrainians lost 70,000 men killed and wounded over the course of September, the heaviest losses by far in the entire period of the special military operation. Zelensky and his officials in Kiev still talk of victory. Victory over the Russians. I don't think anybody any longer believes that this is remotely possible. I wonder whether Zelensky actually does himself, but it sounds increasingly delusional, even as there seems to be very little that anybody can do about it. In terms of Ukraine itself, the mobilization process continues. There have been further articles by people like Ben Wallace, the former British Defence Secretary, in the Daily Telegraph, who continue to urge more and more mobilization, even though the Ukrainian military are complaining that all that it is mobilization is doing is flooding the Ukrainian army with soldiers who do not want to fight, who give up almost at the first battle, and who, when they don't give up because they're so poorly trained, lose their lives almost immediately. The fact that 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers, according to the Russian army, were killed or wounded in September may be a reflection of this. It's a reasonable guess that a very high proportion of those men who were killed and wounded last month are recently called up soldiers, and that this is what partly explains this big increase in Ukrainian casualties that the Russians are claiming. Just saying. But anyway, looking at this whole situation, talking about victory, refusing all talk of negotiations, looks delusional. But as I said, nobody seems to know what to do. Nobody in Ukraine, nobody outside Ukraine in the West really seems to have some idea. Chancellor Scholz of Germany, according to the German media, is now very keen to speak to Putin. The Kremlin, by contrast, is coming back and saying that there is no call scheduled between Putin and Scholz. As I said in my program yesterday, Scholz may be keen to speak to Putin. It doesn't at all follow that Putin is keen to speak to him. Because so far as I can judge from Scholz's own words, all that Scholz is going to propose, if he manages to speak to Putin, is that Putin agree to send a delegation to the next peace summit that the Ukrainians and their Western allies are trying to set up at some undisclosed location, who knows where. The Russians have already ruled that out. They say that any such peace summit set up under those kind of auspices is unacceptable to them, because all that it will do is lead to the whole discussion being moved onto the question, onto Zelensky's peace formula, which is simply a capitulation formula requiring the Russians to withdraw from the whole of pre-2014 Ukraine. And the Russians are not going to do that. So the Russians are going to say no. Putin is going to say no. And if that is Scholz's idea, the Russians probably don't want to hear about it. But no one else seems to have any real plans, any real objectives about what to do. We could see all sorts of frustrated comments starting to appear. Con Coughlin, who is a British journalist, commentator, writing for the Daily Telegraph, perhaps one of the most fervid supporters of Ukraine amongst many in the media. He's just written a piece in the Telegraph talking about how Ukraine is being abandoned, how Zelensky is being left to his fate by the Western powers. And there is that article in The Atlantic that I mentioned yesterday, the article which actually speaks straightforwardly of the abandonment of Ukraine. And it is written by two American former Marine officers, Karl Marlantes and Elliot Ackerman, and it talks about the American strategy in Ukraine is slowly bleeding the nation and its people to death. And the article is in a strange mixture of the insightful and correct and, to my mind, the completely fantastical, because it admits that Ukraine is losing the war, and it is most unhappy about American policy, which it strongly criticizes. The most unsettling thing we saw was the American strategy in Ukraine, one that gives the Ukrainian people just enough military aid not to lose their war, though the rest of the article makes it very clear that they are losing the war, but not enough to win it. This strategy is slowly bleeding Ukraine and its people to death, which is an admission that they are losing the war. So why not straightforwardly say so? And then they say that they are both Marine Corps veterans. We have a combined 60-year breadth of combat experience between us, including Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The horrors of war are not unfamiliar to us, yet both of us felt deeply disturbed as we finished our trip. And then they admit straightforwardly that the military situation for Ukraine is terrible. And they also discuss how the United States is falling behind, that it doesn't understand the pace at which the war is developing. They say that the speed of innovation on the battlefield has made some long-awaited Western weapons all but obsolete by the time they are delivered. 2 weeks before our trip, yet another Abrams tank was destroyed in a top-down attack by a kamikaze drone. They say that only 20 of 31 Abrams tanks delivered by the United States in February remain. I have heard that it's the other way around, that only 11 out of 31 Abrams tanks remain. 20, not 11, have been destroyed. Just saying. Somebody has spun the numbers. But anyway, let's press on. And then they go on to say Ukrainian soldiers at the front told us that any innovation they develop is countered by a Russian response within weeks. Both armies are innovating at a pace that is leaving the sclerotic US and NATO defense industries behind. But of course, it is the Russian industries that have the scale and the capacity to do this, not the Ukrainian ones. And again, I must protest against this practice of trying to put the Ukrainians and the Russians at the same level, when of course they're not. But anyway, let's talk about how American technology, American industries, sclerotic US and NATO defense industries are being left behind. An example of this is HIMARS, the long-range rocket artillery that the United States has provided at a maddeningly slow pace. Was the pace so maddeningly slow? I would have said not. But anyway, they go on to say this. A year ago, HIMARS was the most in-demand system on the battlefield. Now it has a success rate of less than 10% because of Russian innovation in electronic warfare. Each rocket fired by HIMARS costs roughly $100,000. Because of the rapid decrease in HIMARS' effectiveness, the Ukrainians have developed a drone that has a similar impact to the early HIMARS and costs only about $1,000. No drone can substitute for what multiple launch rocket systems do. Just say. So the analogy between this drone, whatever it is, and the HIMARS is obviously wrong. But note the admission that the HIMARS now is all but ineffectual. Its effectiveness has been reduced to less than 10%. But then they go on to say about this new miracle drone that the Ukrainians have developed. The Ukrainians are rightfully worried that within a few weeks the Russians will develop countermeasures and bring the effectiveness of this kind of drone, the one that they've just developed, to replace the HIMARS, down to that of the current HIMARS. In other words, less than 10% effectiveness. It is literally an arms race. The Ukrainians cannot keep up, and nor, it seems, can the United States. But anyway, the article then goes on to say Ukraine's President Zelensky has spent a great deal of time pleading with his allies for weapons and permission to use them to their full capabilities. But he is now pleading simply for the delivery of weapons that have already been pledged. Currently, these delays are the result of US Department of Defense protocols that affect the drawdown rates of US stockpiles. Each of the services is required to keep certain quantities of weapons and ammunition in reserve in case of war, and they're not allowed to dip below these levels. And then they go on to explain why this is actually a sensible approach, and one shouldn't go through all one's arsenals. But then they go on to say this. However, the United States is nowhere near a crisis. If anything, and ironically, we keep our weapons in reserve for a crisis exactly like the one playing out in Ukraine. We must make those weapons available to those who would use them in our shared defense. The war in Ukraine is at risk of being lost. So they admit, in fact, that Ukraine is losing the war, even though previously they suggested that American aid is preventing the Ukrainians from losing, is enabling the Ukrainians to avoid losing the war. But anyway, let's not worry too much about that. The war in Ukraine is at risk of being lost, not because the Russians are winning. How can the Ukrainians lose and the Russians not win? I mean, again, the logic of some of this is difficult to understand. The war in Ukraine is at risk of being lost, not because the Russians are winning, but because Ukraine's allies have not allowed them to win. If we encourage the Ukrainians to fight while failing to give them the tools they need for victory, history will surely conclude that the Russians weren't the only ones who committed crimes against Ukraine. So the idea is this: give Ukraine everything, absolutely everything. The fact that we have run out of ammunition, we run out of air defense missiles, that we have only limited numbers of tanks, limited numbers of armored vehicles, limited numbers of bombs, limited numbers of air defense interceptors. Well, that's not a problem. Let's just give all of that to Ukraine. The Ukrainians can then use that to win. And of course, if they don't, well, there's no explanation of what to do in that case, because after all, it might be that they won't win because the Russians, as these two Marine officers, ex-Marine officers admit, the Russians are able to adapt within weeks to every new weapon system that the West has supplied, and their production, as we have seen, is enormous and greater than that of all of the Western powers combined. But Give it all to the Ukrainians, hope that they win. If they don't, and you're left disarmed, well, well, presumably that's not something to even think about. And in the meantime, don't worry about any other wars in any other places where you might need your weapons, because if you defeat the Russians, well, all the other problems will be solved. Just yesterday, I read out an article in my previous program in the Daily Telegraph about how the US and the Western powers are constrained in their ability to supply air defense missiles to Israel because so many have been already supplied to Ukraine, and the stockpile has now been critically reduced. So wars do happen in multiple places. They have a habit of happening all at the same time. You can't pick and choose, maybe, or maybe you can pick and choose. Maybe you can accept that you're going to lose all of the other wars or not fight all of the other wars. It'd be a good thing if you didn't fight all of the other wars, in my opinion, but presumably these two US Marine officers wouldn't say that. But give everything to Ukraine and all the problems will go away. They will win, or maybe not. And, well, if they don't, we don't know. But if they do, all problems will simply melt away. I said that this is a strange article, combining fact and fantasy. And we can see the fantasy. But what the article also does is highlight again the fundamental truth. There is no war-winning strategy in Ukraine for the West. And it's quite clear that these two very well-connected people writing in the Atlantic, they don't have a diplomatic strategy or an idea for a diplomatic strategy either. They don't urge peace. They don't tell Ukraine, the war is lost, accept that, come to terms, we've run out of what we can do to help you. It's still, as long as it takes, keep fighting, send more of your young men and old men to die, and in the meantime, if it all goes wrong, blame the administration, blame the president for not sending more of everything, in fact, for not sending everything. And that's where the fault for defeat lies. That's, I think, in summary, the state of the thinking in the West at this time. Some plans for a peace summit, which the Russians show no interest in, and fantastic ideas to rush Ukraine into NATO, to give it every weapon that it wants, to allow unrestricted missile strikes across Russia with a tiny number of missiles that are not going to do anything other than provoke the Russians. All of those things. But don't accept the ultimate truth that the war is lost and try to negotiate an outcome, saving what can be saved. Thousands of lives, unquestionably, before the final end. I've said many times that Western policy in this war has been utterly bankrupt. And with this article, we can see it. Well, that is the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work by Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check the subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.